Wild West stories, who knocked on the lonely rancher's door, if not his bride. The storm had torn the wagon apart, leaving only shattered wood and a trail of blood across the snow.
Anyone
Elias
here?
Carter rode into the silence, his horse's breath rising like smoke in the cold air. Behind a rock, a young woman trembled, clutching nothing but fear. When he stepped closer, she whispered, "Don't
What's your name,
come
buddy?"
closer." Elias
Rose.
removed his hat, his voice steady yet gentle. "What's your name?" For a long moment, the storm seemed to hold its breath. Then, with tears in her eyes, she whispered Rose. In that fragile word, she was reborn. He reached out his hand and, with quiet conviction, promised, "You're safe now." And for the first time in the wild silence of the West, hope found a home. On a hill, veiled in gray mist, stood a small wooden cabin, alone against the winter. A thin plume of smoke rose into the heavy sky, like the last breath of a soul still searching for its way home. Elias, the solitary cowboy, opened the door and guided Rose inside. Her body trembled. Her breath came in uneven gasps, and her eyes still carried doubt toward the world. He set her down before the fireplace, where the flames crackled, breathing a flicker of warmth into a house long silent. The room still bore the mark of his lost wife. The photographs remained. The dried flowers in the clay vase stood untouched. Yet the smallest detail weighed heaviest on the heart the chair turned toward the door. Elias had left it that way for 3 years, out of habit, out of an unspoken signal that he was still waiting for someone to return. And now, the one who entered was not Margaret, but Rose, a woman once stripped of her very name, her very worth. In this moment, neither of them yet knew, for the first time in many years, they would learn to see themselves again in each other's eyes. Part 1. The Woman of the Snowstorm. That night, the storm came fiercer than any winter Elias had ever known. The wind shrieked through the mountain pass, like blades lashing against the wooden walls rattling the old door. Snow thickened into a blinding white spiral, blocking paths, covering the sky, drowning every sound except its own howl. Amid the chaos, Elias's cabin on the hill stood alone, the glow of a single oil lamp in the window, like the stubborn breath of a candle refusing to die in the storm. Rose sat huddled against the wall, her torn dress, no shield for her battered body. Elias had only just brought her inside. Her legs still shook with exhaustion and cold. His heavy coat lay across her shoulders, yet her frame remained rigid, like a cornered animal ready to claw if anyone came too close. Elias said nothing, offered no explanations. He busied himself by the stove, his broad hands practiced with wood fire, the steady rituals of ranch life. Each crack of dry logs in the flames echoed like a patient heartbeat. He set a pot to simmer, and soon the plain fragrance of broth and vegetables began to overtake the damp chill, and the lingering scent of fear clinging to Rose. From the shadows, she watched him with wary eyes, bracing for some command, some demand, a look she knew too well after years of submission to others. But Elias neither looked back nor pressed her. When the soup was ready, he ladled it into a clay bowl, set it on the small table, and quietly stepped away. Rose's gaze lingered on the bowl, suspicion in her stare. Experience had taught her that food always came at a price, and rarely one she was willing to pay. Yet hunger roared in her belly. Her throat burned with thirst, her hands trembled. She reached fingers brushing the warm clay heat running into her skin until her whole body quivered, not just from warmth, but from something unfamiliar, being given something without anything taken in return. She lifted the bowl, sipping carefully. The taste was plain a little salty with the faint richness of bone, but to her parched throat, it was sweet as honey. With each swallow, tears welled higher. She tried to stop them, but they fell mixing with the steam, adding a new flavor, the bitterness of memory and the relief of the present. Elias sat across from her gaze, steady on the fire, never piercing her with his eyes. His shadow stretched long across the floor, firm and unmoving, offering no threat. When she had eaten nearly all, he quietly set a piece of dry bread by her side, then stood and turned the heavy wooden chair near the hearth so that it faced the door. Rose frowned slightly. The small gesture, meaningless at first glance, carved itself into her mind. A chair turned toward the door, not the fire, as though its owner forever waited for someone to walk in a habit he had never dared to break. Her eyes roamed the room, catching on framed photographs a fair-haired woman, her smile bright, her eyes kind. The presence of that figure lingered in the cabin, woven into the simple gesture, painting the outline of Elias's long years of waiting. Amid the storm's roar, Rose whispered, her voice hoarse and trembling. "Why? Why did you help me?" Elias turned. His eyes were deep-shadowed, yet free of pity and free of desire. Only the silence of one who had walked through loss and knew the weight of being left behind. He answered, slow and steady, "Because no one deserves to die out there in the storm, and because I know what it means to be left behind." Rose bit her lip, gripping the bowl tighter. His simple words struck through the armor she had built. For years, every voice around her had branded her with a price, had told her she was worthless. For the first time in years, a man had spoken to her as though she were still human. She lowered the bowl, murmuring, "But I'm no one. I don't even have a name anymore." Elias sat straighter, prodded the fire with an iron rod, then looked back, his gaze resolute. "Then choose one. Start again. No one has the right to decide who you are except you." Rose fell silent. The words were simple, yet struck like a hammer against stone. She remembered nights when they had called her Ruby, a name forced on her, a name that carried scorn, reducing her to merchandise. But here, in this small room, with the storm howling outside, she was asked what she wished to be called. A choice. A right she thought forever lost. The night stretched on. Wind battered the cabin walls, testing their strength. Inside, Rose curled into the chair, soothed by the warmth of the fire. Elias sat silent, sleepless, a worn Bible in his hands, his eyes fixed on the door. The chair beside him remained turned outward, somber, faithful to its memory. Rose watched him in secret. In the flickering glow, his face looked weathered, his eyes distant. She realized she was not the only one abandoned, not the only one who had survived life's storms. This man, too, clung to the last embers of something lost, and the lamplight of this cabin in the snow was proof he had not given up. Tears slipped from her eyes, but this time without bitterness, only release. The soup in her hands had cooled, yet its warmth remained coursing through her veins, thawing a part of her heart long frozen. In that moment, Rose understood no storm outside could ever rival the storm within. And perhaps for the first time she had found shelter, not only for her body, but for her soul. Part 2. The name Ruby. The sky after the storm glowed a muted gray-pale light, filtering through the thick clouds, falling upon the snow-covered valley. From the cabin window, Rose gazed outward, watching the earth's breath rise as thin smoke in the cold air. The wind had stilled, yet the air remained biting, as though winter had not departed, but merely paused to gather its strength. In the small kitchen, Elias quietly prepared breakfast. The bitterness of coffee drifted through the room, mingling with the scent of dry bread toasting on the iron pan. The steady sound of a knife slicing smoked meat carried a strange peace. Rose sat at the wooden table, both hands wrapped around a warm enamel cup, her fingers still trembling faintly. She had slept fitfully through the night, but unlike the nights before, no nightmares, no rough hands, no scornful eyes. Only the wind at the door and the crackle of fire. For the first time in years, she awoke belonging to no one but herself. Elias set a plate before her without a word. Rose looked up, hesitated, then gave a small nod. To Elias, that small gesture was like a fragile seed of trust newly planted. They ate in silence. Outside, faint light glistened on icicles beginning to melt, dripping in steady rhythm. That fragile calm made Rose uneasy, fearful it would vanish like every other illusion in her life. It was Elias who broke the silence. Setting down his spoon, his voice was low and steady. "Last night you said you had no name. But everyone has a name. What was yours? Your real name?" The question struck sharp, piercing the wall Rose had built within herself. Her hands tightened around the cup. The hot coffee slid across her lips, but its bitterness could not mask the lump rising in her throat. A name. Such a simple word. Yet for Rose, it carried the weight of a stolen life. She swallowed hard eyes, fixed on the table, her voice hoarse and trembling. To the customers, I was Ruby. To the master, I was only number 7. To my mother, I was Rose. But she's gone, and from that day, no one has called me that again. Silence fell. Only the sound of dripping icicles remained. Elias did not rush to answer. He simply looked at her, not with judgment, nor with pity, but with recognition. "Rose," he said softly, his voice resonant like firelight filling the room. "That is your name." Rose's chest tightened. For years, Rose had survived only as a shadow, in memory bound to her mother's embrace, to lullabies whispered through fragile breaths. When she had been dragged into Corrigan's world, that name had vanished, replaced by Ruby, a glittering but hollow label stamped on her like merchandise to be sold, traded for money and shame. Her lips trembled. Rose is gone. Ruby is all that's left. Elias shook his head, slow but firm. Ruby is the name forced upon you. But Rose, that is who you are. Still here, even if you thought she had died. Rose let out a broken laugh, brittle as glass. You don't understand. Ruby eats. Ruby serves Ruby. Endures. Ruby is everything that remains. Rose is just a luxury of memory. I buried her with my mother. Elias leaned forward, resting an elbow on the table, his gray eyes heavy with both burden and resolve. The woman sitting across from me is not Ruby. Ruby would not weep over a bowl of soup. Ruby would not tremble at the sound of her true name. Ruby had no strength left to fight. But you ran. You survived. You faced the storm out there. Ruby could not have done that. Rose did. Rose froze. His words cut like a mirror into the deepest part of her. where memory and pain wrestled for dominion. She wanted to protest, to deny, but her lips quivered without sound. Outside, the timid sun pushed through the clouds, casting a fragile beam of light. The last icicle broke shattering on the porch, like a whisper that even the cold must one day fade. Rose closed her eyes. Behind her lids, she saw her mother again, thin hands, but warm, stroking her hair. Rose, my daughter, never forget you are my light. The whisper rose above Corrigan's harsh commands, above the cruel laughter of strangers. When she opened her eyes, a tear traced her cheek. She whispered, "Rose, my name is Rose." Elias did not smile, did not cheer. He simply nodded, acknowledging a truth that had always been. Yes, Rose, that is who you are. The silence that followed was no longer heavy. It was a pause, a breath, a space for a soul that had just stepped out of darkness. Rose released her grip on the cup. Her hands cracked, and Ruff now felt lighter. They sat together for a long time. No more words were needed. For sometimes a name is not just a sound, it is the key that unlocks existence. And at that table, the door had just opened for Rose. Part 3. The Hunter. The town of Silver Creek lay nestled in the valley, hemmed in by towering gray cliffs like massive stone walls. Its main road stretched muddy and rutted, marked by wagon wheels and boot heels pressed deep into the earth. That morning, sunlight spread pale gold across puddles of melting snow, making the whole town glimmer, yet with a chill that offered no warmth. The streets were sparsely filled, a few miners, some housewives, children darting near the general store. But the air shifted when a black carriage rolled to a stop in the town square. Silence fell. The children's laughter cut short as if a cloud had smothered the sun. The door swung open. A man stepped down, large, heavy-set, dressed in a polished black vest and wide-brimmed hat pulled low. Shiny leather boots sank into the mud, but he did not care. It was Silas Corrigan, a name everyone in Silver Creek knew, though none dared speak it aloud. Owner of brothels, trader of flesh, a man who built his fortune on women's bodies. His gaze swept over the crowd like a buyer at market choosing livestock. Some men dropped their eyes, others hurried wives and children indoors. But Corrigan wasn't here for them. He had come with one purpose. In his hand, he held a bundle of papers, bound in red string. Mounting the wooden steps of the courthouse, he turned his voice booming. "Listen well, people of Silver Creek. One of my possessions has run away. She thinks she can escape." But here he shook the papers high. "Here is the contract of ownership sealed in red. She is no free woman. She is my property, and I will take her back." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some men shook their heads. Others avoided each other's eyes. No one dared challenge him openly. In this land, such papers stained with blood and signed in filth still bore the weight of law. Across the square in a small inn, Rose heard every word. She and Elias had come into town for supplies. The window stood slightly open, the wind carrying Corrigan's scornful laughter. Rose's blood froze. She turned to Elias, lips pale. He has it." Elias's brow furrowed. His hand drifted instinctively to the grip of his revolver. Though he did not draw it, he would not turn this place into a gunfight. He gently pulled Rose back from the window, but she had already seen. The edge of the contract fluttered in Corrigan's fist. Yellowed parchment thick and rough, stamped with a red seal that looked like dried blood, and scrawled across its center in jagged black ink the name Ruby. Rose clenched her fists until blood pricked her palms. The image slammed into memory that night, long ago forced to sign her name in her own blood. A cut to her finger, a trembling signature dripping scarlet onto the page. Corrigan's coarse laughter in her ear. "Now you belong to me, Ruby." Her face turned ashen, her lips rigid. Elias saw her body trembling like a tree in a gale. He whispered, "He will not take you back. Not while I live." But Rose did not answer. Her eyes stayed fixed on the square on the blood-stained paper. Inside, her two voices clashed, one the scream of memory, declaring she was forever Ruby, nothing more than property. The other, soft but steadfast, the voice from last night. "What is your true name?" Outside, Corrigan folded the contract, tucked it into his coat. He descended the steps, boots thick with mud, chest puffed with pride. He knew the law of Silver Creek belonged to those with money, and he had more than enough. "Hear me now," he bellowed, eyes sweeping the crowd. "Any who shelter that woman, any who dare hide Ruby, are enemies of mine. And trust me, none in Silver Creek wish to be enemies of Silas Corrigan." The crowd stood silent, fear etched in every face. Corrigan smiled, satisfied, tipped his hat, and climbed back into the carriage. The wheels rolled away, leaving deep black tracks in the mud. Inside the inn, Rose backed away and collapsed onto a chair, breath-ragged eyes wide as though she had seen a ghost. Elias knelt beside her, his hand firm on her shoulder. "Rose, look at me," he said, his voice unyielding. "You are not Ruby. He may hold all the papers he wants, but he does not hold you. Not anymore." Rose lifted her eyes, brimming with tears. A drop fell onto the wooden table, spreading into a dark stain. She whispered, as if afraid to hope, "Will anyone believe me? The papers say I belong to him. The law stands with him. All I have is a name he already stole." Elias's grip tightened, his gaze blazing. "Then we'll take it back. Before him, before the world itself. Rose will never disappear again." Outside, Corrigan's horses carried him farther from the square. But in Rose's heart, the echo of that old blood seal still clung like a brand. Tonight, when the mist descended, she would face a choice to keep trembling under the name Ruby, or to rise and defend the name Rose. Part 4. $350. Late afternoon, the last pale rays of sun spilled across the faded grasslands. The storm had passed. The snow was melting, leaving behind muddy patches and the damp, earthy scent of thaw. On the hillside porch, Elias sat unmoving, a half-burned cigarette between his fingers, his gaze fixed on the far horizon, where Silver Creek lay silent. In his coat pocket rested a folded slip of paper. Not Corrigan's contract, but a deed of appraisal for his land, the only inheritance left from his father, beyond a gun and a few horses. Its value, $350. The exact bidder price Corrigan had demanded for returning Ruby. Elias gripped the paper, hard, calloused hands trembling with anger. Land to him was not mere property. It was sweat blood, his family's past. But when he looked back toward the cabin where Rose sat by the fire, a question gnawed at him. If he sold it all, could he buy her freedom? Inside, Rose clutched a thin shawl around her shoulders. For days, she had hardly left the cabin. News of Corrigan brandishing the contract through town had kept her in hiding. By night, the nightmares returned, mocking laughter, the stench of liquor, rough hands, Each time she jolted awake, Elias was there in the chair by the door, eyes open hand, resting on his revolver. He stayed awake so she could sleep. But today, his face was different. Heavy, determined. Elias stepped inside and laid the folded paper on the table. "Rose," he said, his voice hoarse, "I have a way. I can sell this land. For $350, I'll pay Corrigan. Then he'll have no claim over you. You'll be free." Rose froze. For a moment, her heart faltered. $350. The same number Corrigan had once spat with a sneer, calling her merchandise. Now Elias spoke it, but with the intent to rescue. Still, the chill returned, no matter from whom a price was still a chain. She rose to her feet, her voice trembling, but firm. "No, Elias, don't you see? If I can be bought again, then I am still a prisoner." Elias faltered. He thought of the nights she wept, of the scars on her body, of the fear etched into her bones. All of it urged him to end her torment. He stepped closer for once, pleading. "But Rose, it's the fastest way. I can lose the land, but I cannot stand to see you live in this fear. I only want to protect you." Rose shook her head, tears falling. She covered her face, then looked up, her voice breaking yet fierce. "Protecting me doesn't mean buying my freedom. That's not freedom, Elias. That's just another cage, gilded maybe, but still a cage." Her words cut deep. Elias thought of Margaret, his late wife, whom he could not save from sickness. He had sworn never again to lose someone he loved. Yet now he understood protecting Rose did not mean deciding for her, nor paying a price that bound her anew. He sank into the chair, head in his hands. Silence thickened, broken only by the crackle of fire. Rose stepped closer, sitting across from him. Her eyes were red, but alight with strength. "Elias," she whispered, "don't you see? Since I met you for the first time, I've been called by my true name. I am Rose, not Ruby, not merchandise. If you buy me even with kindness, the name Rose will vanish again, and I cannot lose it a second time." Elias lifted his eyes to hers. In them, he saw not only pain, but an unyielding will to live. With a long breath, he folded the deed once more and cast it into the fire. The paper flared, curling into ash. Rose watched her chest rising fast. Relief surged through her veins. She had taken another step from her past, and Elias had chosen to stand beside her, not to purchase her freedom, but to fight for it. He turned his voice steady and warm. "Then we'll find another way. A way no one can deny." Rose nodded, her rough hands clasping his. In the firelight, an unspoken vow was forged. Freedom would never again be bought or sold. Outside, the wind began to rise once more. But within the cabin, the fire blazed brighter than ever. Part 5. The Flame of Justice. The sky above the town hung heavy with gray clouds as they arrived, as though nature itself sensed that today would be fateful. Snow lingered in dirty patches along the road wagon wheels, grinding through with a creak that set nerves on edge. Rose sat in Elias's wagon, her hands clasped tightly, fingers cold, but her heart burning hot. The old fear was still there, coiled around her like an invisible rope, but beneath it flickered something new, resolve. Sarah Mitchell's office stood at the end of the main street between the blacksmith and the general store. A modest red brick building, with a wooden sign swaying in the wind, Mitchell & Co., attorney at law. As Rose stepped down, she felt as though she were entering another realm, not Elias's home, not Corrigan's hell, but neutral ground, a place where ink could weigh as heavy as chains or cut as sharp as a sword. Sarah Mitchell, a woman in her 40s, greeted them with sharp eyes and a steady voice. She wore a plain black dress with crisp white cuffs, her hair neatly pinned, devoid of vanity. Her eyes were those of someone who had witnessed too much injustice, yet never once yielded to it. "You're right on time," Sarah said, extending a hand. Elias nodded in reply. Rose bowed her head slightly. Mitchell's gaze held Rose not with pity, nor with judgment, but as one human being to another. The simple recognition made Rose's heart tremble. Inside the office smelled of old paper ink and coal ash, a mix that was both suffocating and oddly reassuring. Stacks of files towered like walls, and at the center on a great wooden desk, a blank set of documents lay waiting. Rose knew here she would rewrite her fate. Sarah sat and drew a bundle of papers from her drawer. "I've reviewed your case," she began. "Corrigan is relying on a debt contract, but its terms show clear signs of violating federal laws against forced labor. If we file suit, we stand a strong chance of overturning it." She paused, her eyes on Rose. "But this means war. You'll have to testify. You'll have to relive those years of suffering. It will not be easy." Rose swallowed hard, her gaze dropping to her scarred hands. Memories surged, slammed doors endless nights when she had no name but Ruby. Corrigan's taunts still echoed in her ears. But when she lifted her eyes, she saw Elias watching her. Not pressing, not demanding, simply present like a pillar. She drew in a deep breath. "I don't want to run anymore," Rose whispered, steady though soft. "I won't let him keep doing to other girls what he did to me. If I stay silent, I am no different from him." A brief silence fell. Then Sarah nodded, the faintest smile curving her lips. "That answer, Rose, is the very flame justice needs." "Then let us begin." She pushed the papers across the desk. Complaints, affidavits, cold words printed in neat type, but each syllable heavy with the weight of lives. Rose's pulse quickened. Never before had she signed anything in her own favor. From childhood, every document had been a shackle: her mother's debt notes, Corrigan's contract receipts for her own body. For the first time, this paper was a door opening. Sarah placed a quill beside it. "Your name, not Ruby. The name you claim as yours." Rose inhaled, hand trembling, as she took the pen. Black ink gleamed under the oil lamp. The world seemed to fall silent, only her heartbeat and the crackle of fire in the stove. She wrote Rose. The letters trembled but did not break. Every curve, every stroke was a silent scream against the years she had been erased. As the final letter closed, a tear fell, smudging the ink. She did not wipe it away. She let it stand a witness to truth. Elias laid a hand on her shoulder. "You just saved yourself, Rose," he said, his voice rough. "And maybe others too." Sarah gathered the paper, sliding it into the stack of case files. "From this moment, we are at open war. Corrigan will fight. He will bribe. He will threaten. But this time, he won't be facing a nameless commodity. He will face a woman." Her eyes met Rose's sharp as a blade. "Are you ready for that?" Rose clenched her fists, her heart trembling, but alight. "I've already died once, Mrs. Mitchell. From now on, I intend only to live." In that instant, the yellow lamplight in the small office blazed like fire, and in the eyes of Sarah Elias and Rose herself, for the first time, there was something that looked like hope. Part 6. The sister's night wind swept across the roof of the old church, carrying with it the chill of winter, and the scent of rotting wood. The broken bell swayed groaning with each movement, as if it too remembered the sorrows once trapped within these walls. The church had long been abandoned, but tonight candlelight flickered inside, illuminating faces far too familiar with darkness. Rose sat in the front pew, hands trembling in her lap. Beside her stood Elias, silent, steadfast, a pillar rather than a guide. But when the heavy wooden door creaked open, Rose held her breath. Figures entered one by one. 2, then 5, then 12. 12 women each with a different form, but with the same gaze, the gaze of survivors. Sarah Mitchell led them in solemn, as though escorting witnesses to the stand. She gestured for them to take their seats along the pews. Rose turned her eyes, meeting theirs, and she realized each woman was a story, each one a wound unhealed. The first was Maria, her black hair brushing her shoulders, her sun-browned skin marked by years of labor. Her eyes carried tears too old to shed, etched permanently into their corners. She clutched a frayed shawl, like the last thread holding her together. Beside her sat Beth, so young that Rose's chest ached. Barely 17, her lips pressed tight, as though afraid a single word would summon punishment. Faint red welts still circled her wrists. Then Helena, a widow with 3 children forced into debt contracts. Her face hollow, her eyes downcast to the cold stone floor, but her trembling fingers clutched a rosary as if begging for a miracle long delayed. And others, Clara June Mabel, each bearing a name, a story, a heavy step into the church. Rose drew a deep breath, emotions crashing within her. For the first time in years, she felt she was not an exception, not a lone soul condemned by fate. Before her sat a sisterhood not of blood, but of truth. Each one had been sold, owned, reduced to merchandise. Sarah's voice cut through the silence, steady and ringing beneath the church's high dome. We are here for one reason, not to mourn the past, but to decide the future. Rose is no longer Ruby, and you none of you are debts anymore. Tonight each of you will speak your truth. No more silence. The air stilled. The candles hissed faintly. Maria was the first to speak. Her voice was low, steady, as though she had recited the words to herself countless times. I was sold to Corrigan at 19. My husband died and left debts. Corrigan said he'd forgive them if I worked for him. 6 years have passed. I kept his saloon alive with my body, my tears. But the debt never shrank. All I have left is a shell and a heart turned to stone. Her voice broke. Rose gave a small nod, as if lending her strength. Beth faltered, then spoke fragile, as a bird testing its song. I signed my name. I thought it was work, as a seamstress. But then, they locked me in. Called me by a name that wasn't mine. Told me I was stupid for believing. I was 16 when I signed. A sob broke the air. The room sank deeper into painful truth. One by one they spoke. Helena told of working to pay for medicine her children would never see. Clara told of being traded by her father for a new wagon. June told of beatings that nearly killed her for daring to resist. Each testimony was a knife in Rose's chest, yet each also felt like a plank in the sea-proof. No one drifted alone anymore. Rose listened, eyes blurred with tears. When the last voice faded, Sarah nodded. You have done the hardest thing, you have spoken truth. Now the law must hear it. But first, look around you. They did. 13 pairs of eyes rose and the 12 others met across the pews. And in that moment, the abandoned church became a sanctuary once more. Rose rose to her feet, her voice trembling, but carrying far. We are not alone anymore. He wanted each of us to believe we were worthless, mere goods. But look around, he could not kill our souls. We are here flesh and blood, tears and strength. From this day, we belong not to him, but to ourselves and to each other. Maria wiped her cheek. Helena lowered her rosary, nodding instead. Beth managed a faint, fragile smile. Rose stepped from the pews, walking toward the church's doors. On the steps, the night wind struck her face. She sat gazing upward at the starlit sky. A moment later, the others followed until all 13 sat together along the cold stone steps. And then, as if by silent command, the tears came, not just each woman's grief, but a collective cry. Maria wept for 6 stolen years. Beth for a childhood erased. Helena for children who would never know why their mother vanished. Rose for all of them and for herself. But as their tears mingled on the stone, no one was alone. Elias, standing with the horses at a distance, clenched his fists. Never had he seen such power strength born not of guns or wealth, but of unity, forged in pain and hope. Sarah, watching from the doorway, saw them and knew this was evidence stronger than any document. They had begun to believe in one another, and when women begin to believe in one another, the empires of men like Corrigan will tremble. Rose lifted her face, eyes swollen but blazing. "Tomorrow we will stand before the law," she whispered. "But tonight we stand before ourselves, and we have already won." That night, the wind sweeping through the church no longer sounded like mourning, but like a hymn of freedom. Part 7. The long night before the trial. Night fell early, as if the sky itself wished to close its eyes before what tomorrow would bring. Wind came up from the valley, carrying the scents of old snow and dry grass, slipping through the cabin's boards with small, plaintive creaks. On the hill, Elias's cabin stood still as a creature holding its breath. A warm ribbon of lamplight spilled across the porch, catching in a drift of dust like moths that would not leave the flame, unaware of the vast black sea beyond. Elias sat in the wooden chair by the front door. An old habit made bone deep. His revolver lay across his thighs, not raised, not threatening, merely present a promise. His eyes, dark and wakeful, watched through the window's narrow slit. On the table, a small iron pot of coffee stirred, whispering, as if careful not to break the hush. He poured a cup. The bitter steam lifted, threaded with the scent of pine smoke, keeping company with eyes trained by long watches. Inside, Rose sat on the worn rug before the stove. The fire quivered red and stubborn as a beating heart. On the small table lay the packet from Sarah, statements, names, and dates. Places little nails pinning her story to the solid world, so that tomorrow, before skeptical eyes, she would have something to hold when the past tried to drag her under. She had read them again and again until the letters blurred into firelight, until her throat went dry. Yet she still could not bring herself to tie the pages shut. Elias glanced over and saw her shoulders strung like a bow. He set down his cup and rose. His boots made a low, warm sound on the floorboards. He said nothing. At the stove, he warmed milk with honey. The sweet scent drifted out, softening the bite of coffee and taking some barbs out of the air. Rose looked up, met his eyes, then let them slip away like a startled doe shying from a lantern. "Drink something warm," he said, voice low, careful not to crack the night. "It'll be a long one." She nodded. Her hands cupped the porcelain bowl. Heat pressed into her palms until the tremor in her fingers eased. She sipped, listening to the wind sweep the sill like an old broom, pushing needless noises out of the cabin. Only the fire's crackle remained, the wooden clock's slow ticks, and two people breathing. "You'll stay up?" Rose asked, eyes lingering on the chair turned toward the door. The chair that never changed its aim. A sad, gentle ritual. "Yeah," Elias said, pulling a thick blanket across his knees, his hand resting lightly on the gun's spine. "Till sunrise. Tomorrow." Rose faltered, tightening her grip on the bowl. She drew the sweet milk down her throat, hoping it would smooth the words she had long feared to speak. "Tomorrow, I'll have to say it all. Every room, every name, every touch. I'm afraid I'll lose my voice, or my mind, or lose my name." Elias tilted his head. "Which name, Ruby?" She breathed a fog of sound. "The name they stuffed down my throat. There were times when someone called it, and I turned before I remembered I wasn't the thing they were calling." She gave a laugh, thin without self-pity, as if she had worn out the ability to mourn herself. "I'm afraid that under the court's cold eyes, I'll forget the one thing I fought to win back." "What's that?" Rose looked straight at him. In her eyes, the fire stretched into a long, wavering streak, flickering but firm. "My name is Rose." The wind landed heavy on the door. Elias shifted the revolver, not in alarm, but by reflex, and went still again. He remembered the night she first crossed this threshold, hands shaking the bowl till the rim clicked. The way she touched the chair, turned toward the door, as if it were a waiting you could feel. The morning the snow began to melt when he asked, "What is your true name?" And the old brand new word rose out of the mud of memory. All of it braided into a thin cord, tying him to the present, to the reason he still drew breath. Tomorrow, Elias said, anyone might forget. The court might forget. The papers might try to make you forget. I won't. If your voice slips, look at me. And what will you say, Rose asked, half testing him, half throwing a line toward shore, that your name is Rose? She nodded, eyes bright with damp. Strange. For years I dreamed of grand things escape a day, with no one calling me a kind face in a crowd. But now that peace has touched skin, what I want sounds small enough to laugh at. How small? A small room with enough light to read, she murmured, eyes drifting to Meg's old shelf. A wooden table scarred by ink that I spilled myself. A basin of warm water I don't need permission to use. And a voice that says my name when night comes. Elias went quiet a beat. He looked at his calloused hands. The rope cuts the old knife scar. He pictured the little room, a bottle of ink by the window, these hands learning to write more than hay ledgers and cattle counts. Those small things, he said, are what keep folks alive when everything else breaks. Rose smiled faintly. Tonight, I want to let myself wish one more thing, nothing grand. Say it. That when I go to bed, she blinked, someone will say goodnight and call me by the right name. Not to soothe a child or quiet a spent animal, but because I'm a person. And because they believe I'll still be one in the morning. The words hung between them like a light scarf, passing over the fire, uncindered, only warmed. Elias glanced at the narrow bed in the corner, set to face the first line of dawn as she liked. He thought of Meg, the sound of her setting a cup of water on the table of her nights of coughing, his own voice gone ragged and useless. The old pain rose, not tearing this time, only reminding him the heart could still feel. Rose, he said softly, Go on to bed. Tomorrow will be long." She weighed the packet on the table. Then, like placing the last pebble on a cairn, she closed it and tied the brown cloth band. She stood, drew the woolen scarf tight, and went to the little shelf where a jar of dried flowers sat. Her fingers brushed the brittle stem. It crackled like time thinning. "Tomorrow," she said, not turning. "Whatever they call me, I'll answer with this name. You'll remind me if I forget, I will," Elias said, and only as the word left him did he realize it had come as I in a way that needed no permission. It wasn't loud, wasn't forced. It fit like an old coat settling back on the shoulder. Night sank a notch deeper. On the roof, snow crust dropped in soft taps like a stranger's cold knuckles on wood. Elias rose, checked the bolt, glanced at the windows secure. He turned the lamps down, leaving one by the door and one on the shelf near the bed. Their yellow pooled beneath their shades like two gentle eyes watching over a room with little more than a few objects and a few spoken truths. Rose stood by the bed and unclasped a thin silver chain, the last relic of childhood. The metal caught the flame, flashed once, and lay still on white linen. She slipped her bare feet beneath the heavy quilts and drew a long breath. The old mattress sighed. She pulled the covers to her chest and looked his way. Elias leaned against the doorframe, his shadow cut across the lamplight dark coat and wide-brim hat hanging from the peg. He did not come closer. He understood that boundaries were the loveliest thing about this night, and the thing they had built together out of trust, one to stand guard, one to sleep. Two halves of a single house. Elias, her voice a thread of mist. Thank you for keeping the chair turned toward the door," she said with a small smile. "Because of it, I feel someone had been waiting for me before I ever arrived." He looked at the chair. The wood shone, with years the arms worn thin by too many grips. It had been Meg's, then his, a symbol of unspoken waiting. For Rose, it had become proof that not every door would close behind her. "The chair will keep facing the door," Elias said, "until you tell me to turn it toward the fire." Rose breathed an as if penciling a promise for some later day. The wind shifted, carrying a far scent of new snow. Somewhere below the hill, the Parker's dog barked twice and fell silent. The sky rasped the pines like sandpaper on wood, slow, steady shore. Rose shut her eyes. Her lids trembled, then stilled. He heard her breath lengthen and even out. His heart settled into her rhythm, two instruments finding the same beat. He lifted his cup for the last swallow, cold now, but a kindly bitterness. He set it down and ran a thumb along the gun's ridge, not from fear, but out of the old habit of thanking a tool that had kept his back straight. Then he turned toward the bed and let the words leave his throat at a volume meant to remain, to linger, to open the first door of an unbroken dream. "Good night, Rose." No answer came. Only the faintest shift of her mouth, a ripple of a smile so small you'd have to stand close to see it, a smile he knew even from afar. Because tonight, the wish wasn't to shut her eyes, but to open a quiet room inside her, where a name lay on the pillow like a clean handkerchief, ready to be carried into the morning. He returned to the chair by the door, wood at his back, his eyes on the night. On the wall, the clock ticked, tock, tock, tock. Each beat a step toward that thin border between fear and courage. He ran the route for morning in his mind, taking the forest edge down to town, avoiding the main road, starting early to lessen the stares, meeting Sarah on the courthouse steps to order the witnesses. Each point stood like a stake driven in wet ground. The night drew out. Once or twice, he thought he saw movement far down the slope, a dark speck, and then nothing. He didn't leave the chair, only cocked his head and listened. No hoofbeats, no brush of metal on leather. Only the night larger, gentler than fear ever claimed. It had been a long time since he'd found the night gentle. He glanced at the bed. Rose's hands had slipped free of the quilt palms, open as if nothing was left to clutch. The packet of testimony lay half an arm's length away, tidy ready. On the cover, the name Rose stood black and bold dry, now beyond smudging. Before dawn, a heavy cloud dragged across the sky, pulling a gray cap over the hill. He tugged the blanket higher and let himself sink into the chair. In the old wooden house, everything found its place, the revolver asleep, the iron pot quiet, the lamps blinking slow. Everything, except 2 sentences still burning. My name is Rose. And good night, Rose. When the first thin blade of light cut the window's edge, Elias stood and rubbed warmth into his hands. He opened the tin, pulled 2 slices of bread, and laid them on the pan. The smell rose and shouldered out the last scent of night granting passage to the day. He looked to the bed once more. Rose turned in her sleep, her breath still even. He did not wake her. A person only gets a few nights like this in a lifetime, the kind where good night brings a heart safely down. Outside, the town still slept. Corrigan might already be twisting the crown of his pocket watch, plotting his counterstrike. The law might be as slow as an old ox. But in the cabin on the hill, something had begun to move faster than schemes a life-changing course. It began without a gunshot, without a vengeful oath, began with a small wish and a plain salutation. Enough to make a long night less afraid. Enough that tomorrow, in a cold room, before many old eyes when they ask the woman will lift her face and answer clearly as if she has been called by her true name the whole night through. Part 8. The Trial. The Redstone Town Hall had never been so full. From early morning, people streamed in boots thudding on ground still wet with dew. Farmers in thick coats, mothers with infants, old men on canes, wide-eyed boys who'd never set foot in so solemn a place. News of the trial between Rose and Silas Corrigan had outrun the wind, carrying the promise of something unheard of: a woman once treated as merchandise, daring to stand against the most powerful man in the region. Outside, horses crowded the square, their whinnies mixing with a low roar of voices. Inside, the air was strung so tight that even whispers bounced off the tall wooden ceiling. Daylight slanted through narrow high windows, pooling on the raised bench where the judge would sit. The room smelled of sweat-damp leather and the morning's cook fires clinging to people's clothes. Elias sat in the front row, his broad back a windbreak behind Rose. He knew, though, that today he was not her shield. Today, Rose would stand on her own. He would witness, and if needed, be the silent shoulder behind her. Rose sat beside attorney Sarah Mitchell, hands clenched together in her lap, fingers trembling yet resolute. A plain brown dress, a woolen shawl hiding the green-yellow bruises at her throat, but no trace remained of the lowered gaze of the days when she'd been called by a name forced upon her. When the judge's gavel struck Thock, all talk ceased. A rough, steady voice carried, This court convenes to hear the matter of dispute between Mr. Silas Corrigan and... He glanced down the pen, paused over a new word, rose a woman formerly known as Ruby Sinclair. A rustle went through the room. Rose drew a breath and lifted her chin. Corrigan stood opposite Gut, straining his black waistcoat fat spilling at his collar. He wore a thin smile, the kind of man who believed the law lived in his coat pocket. In his hand, a bundle of old papers, edges yellowed, the red seal blotted and dim. He held it high for all to see. Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen, this is a lawful contract signed by the mother of that woman. He slapped the pages. The sound cracked across the hall. It proves she owes me $350. By law, when she fails to pay, she is under my ownership until the burden is cleared. A few men nodded. Some women drew breath as if hearing a sentence. Sarah rose, eyes bright as steel. Your Honor, the document is void. Its terms violate federal statutes against forced labor. More than that, it is built on coercion and exploitation. No human being can be the property of another. Corrigan sneered. Lawyers and their tricks with words. Who here doesn't know who Ruby Sinclair is? He swept the room, lingering on the name, Ruby. A runaway whore, a broken piece of goods. And broken goods are either returned or discarded. The hall shuddered. Rose's face went pale, but she did not bend. Her eyes found Elias. He gave a single nod, not pity, not prompting more, like a lamp holding the rhythm. Sarah leaned in and murmured, It's time. Rose stood. Benches scraped. The floorboards groaned. She stepped to the center of the room, where every gaze converged. Her heart hammered like a war drum, but her steps held. Facing Corrigan, she met his eyes. My name is Rose. Her voice was not loud, but each word landed clean. Ruby Sinclair is dead. Silence sealed the room. Even the wind at the door seemed to listen. Rose went on steadier now. The name Ruby was never mine. It was a label he pinned on me to sell me, to use me, to lock me in the hell he called a contract. He calls me merchandise. But merchandise doesn't feel pain. It doesn't cry. It doesn't remember its mother. I do. I cried. I hurt. And I remembered the woman who bore me. In the corner, an old woman wiped her eyes. A few men looked at the floor. Rose lifted the paper. Sarah had given her a copy of a federal ruling. Here is the truth, that contract is void. But even if it were lawful, it would still be wrong. Because no one has the right to own another's soul or dignity. She turned to the crowd. Do you have daughters, sisters? If one day someone came set a price of $350 and claimed it was enough to make her a piece of property, would you stand silent? A wave moved through the hall. Corrigan flushed and barked. Shut your mouth, you have no right to speak. You are a debtor. Rose faced him, eyes cold as ice. I owe you nothing. I am not Ruby. I am Rose. And I am free. Silence again, then from the back bench a single clap. Sharp, sharp. A middle-aged woman stood, eyes wet. Another clap, joined then another. In moments, the hall erupted applause, rolling like thunder benches, rattling boots pounding the floor. The judge hammered his gavel again and again, unable to stem the tide. Rose did not weep. She stood straight, her shoulders trembling, not with fear, but with a weight lifted from her chest. Elias's eyes shone bright with pride. Corrigan stepped back, sweat beading his brow. In the din, he recognized it. The power he had gripped was melting like ice under sun. At last, the gavel crashed. Order, order. The noise ebbed, humming like far thunder. The judge looked from Corrigan to Rose. In the light falling through the window, age carved his face, but his voice rang. This court declares that contract null and void. No human being is the property of another. Any act of coercion to confine or exploit Miss Rose shall be deemed a crime. This time, the cheers broke loose, unstoppable. Rose closed her eyes. The words fell like a blade severing the invisible chain that had dragged behind her for years. She turned, seeking Elias. He stood there, eyes bright, lips forming 3 words. Good night, Rose. Amid the storm of applause, Rose smiled, and for the first time in her life, the smile did not tremble, did not fear. It was the smile of a free woman. Part 9. The Man Who Lost Power. The Redstone Town Market bustled that afternoon as always. Donkeys strained against carts. Children darted between stalls. Sellers cried their wares in a jumble of sound. But the air carried something different. People clustered in knots. Voices hushed, yet relentless, all speaking of the morning's trial. She was so brave, said a baker's wife, waving a flour-dusted ladle. I've never heard a woman speak like that in front of men with power. An old man muttered, his eyes bright. Ruby is dead. Only Rose remains a young girl, said her voice like a bell repeating the words, as if to carve them into memory. And amid their murmurs, Silas Corrigan stepped out of the courthouse, without his entourage, without the respectful eyes that once trailed him. His black hat, once a symbol, now only shadowed half a face, swollen and purple with hatred. He paused at the threshold, looking around. The crowd parted, not blocking his way, yet not yielding in reverence as before. The space that opened around him was cold, stripped of submission. Corrigan drew a long breath, forcing himself upright. His boots struck hard as he strode into the market. But instead of bowing, passers-by edged aside in silence, watching him like a spent beast stumbling toward its end. At the butcher's stall, a man who had once fawned over him clenched his jaw and turned away, chopping bone with deliberate force. At the tavern stall, the seller avoided his eyes, offering no greeting. The young men who used to orbit him now stood together whispering, but not one stepped forward. A stone pressed heavy on Corrigan's chest. He who had ruled with fear was walking through the very place that once bowed low, unmet by a single hand. He growled, "You think I've lost? The law is still on my side." The words dropped like stones into water. No reply. A boy of 7, a farmer's son, stared straight at him. Then spoke his voice high, but clear enough for all to hear. "He's the man who tried to sell people." The market froze. His mother yanked him back in fright. But instead of rage, the crowd broke into laughter. Not joyous laughter, bitter, releasing years of swallowed silence. Corrigan blanched. He clutched the old contract, holding it aloft. Here's the proof. Proof she belongs to me." The wind caught it. The paper shook, then a stronger gust tore it free. It tumbled, landed in mud, the blood seal bleeding into brown water. The people watched. None stooped to pick it up. He bent, reaching, but his boot slipped. Mud splashed his coat. A young man sneered, "That's all your power is." A filthy scrap of paper. A murmur rose, then voices joined stronger. He built his wealth by selling women. He called us ignorant peasants fit only to plow his fields. We've had enough. Corrigan's staggered eyes darting for loyalty, for fear to clutch. None. Even Jimmy, his once faithful hound, stood in the crowd, head bowed, unmoving. "You'll regret this," Corrigan bellowed, voice cracking. I'll return with law, with guns, with men who remember what they owe me." But his voice rasped hollow. An old man leaned on his cane, eyes sharp as nails. No one owes gratitude to a man who feasted on others' bones. "Be gone, Corrigan," a chant swelled. "Be gone, be gone." It rolled like surf, forcing him back step by step. He stumbled, fell face first, his hands clawing at mud. No one offered a hand. When he rose, his eyes met Rose's. She stood at the market's edge, Elias and Sarah at her side. No curse, no venom, only silence. The silence of someone once reduced to a thing, now watching him as nothing more than a shadow fading away. Corrigan trembled. For the first time, he felt small. His shadow stretched across the dirt, then shrank as he turned, slipping into a narrow, dark alley. No one followed. No one blocked. No one cared. The crowd dispersed, voices rising again, not in fear, but in release. People spoke of Rose, of her words in court. The name Ruby sank beneath their footsteps, buried in the dust. Elias came beside her, laying his steady hand on her shoulder. Sarah's smile flickered, her eyes lit with conviction. Rose watched Corrigan vanish into darkness. Within her, Rosa Truth, the most frightening monster, was never the man with the gun, but the fear he sowed. Today, that fear had died, and with it, his power. Part 10. The House of Light. The last snows of the season had melted, leaving damp earth marked with the hoofprints and boot tracks of troubled days now past. Redstone returned to its ordinary rhythm, merchants calling at their stalls, children chasing chickens, men laughing loud in the saloon. Yet something invisible lingered in the air, like a new breath spreading across the town. No one lowered their eyes at the name of Silas Corrigan anymore. No one whispered of contracts or blood debts. That name had faded into shadow. On the hill, Elias and Rose's cabin stood in the twilight. Smoke rose straight from the chimney, scented with bread and vegetable stew, sign to the world that this was no longer a refuge of solitude, but a home. Rose stood on the porch sleeves, rolled hair tied back. Peace swelled inside her like a tide. 3 months since the trial, life felt like a new chapter. No more nights waking from nightmares. No trembling at the sound of hoofbeats on the road. Elias came from the barn with hay on his shoulder. He was no longer the man of stone he had seemed, but one whose step had lightened, whose eyes no longer gazed only at the past. When he saw Rose on the porch, he smiled a smile once reserved for Margaret, now returned not in replacement, but as proof life still stretched forward. "The backfield's greening," Elias said, setting down the hay. "Like you said, the frost didn't bite too late." Rose wiped her hands on her apron. "Not Miss Elias. You know that?" "Just Rose." He nodded slowly, as if carving the word into wood. Rose. The name hung in the air, like the last plank sealing a house built anew. The cabin no longer looked as it had when Margaret died. Rose had changed much, not to erase the past, but to weave new threads of living. On the table beside Meg's picture frame stood jars of wildflowers she picked each morning. In the kitchen, jars of spice lined the shelves, and a drawer held hand-sewn cloths stitched by her own fingers. A small side room had become Rose's corner, a writing desk, notebooks, and a lamp always lit. Each night, she wrote no longer despair, but dreams. Dreams of a large garden, a school for the girls of town, a home with a light shining for any soul lost in the dark. Elias often stood quiet at the door, watching her write. He never asked, never intruded. But once, When she closed the journal, he said only, "This house was never lit through the night. Now it is." Rose touched the lamp's glass and smiled. Because now, it's a real home. Day by day, they worked together. Elias rebuilt the fences. Rose painted them a soft earth brown. She planted daisies by the porch, simple white, stubborn against the wind. Elias grumbled, "Flowers don't feed a man." Rose answered, eyes bright, "They feed hope. And sometimes hope matters more than bread." He laughed and didn't argue. He'd come to see that a house needed not only strong beams, but also color and fragrance. At the stove, Rose made soups and pies Elias had never imagined on this hard land. In turn, Elias taught her how to swing an axe, to split logs without scatter, how to hold a rifle steady. Rose disliked guns, but she listened. Not to kill, Elias said, but to guard what we hold dear. Word of Rose's victory traveled. Women once bound by contracts came to the hilltop cabin to see with their own eyes that her story was real. One evening, 12 women sat on the steps like the night in the church when they wept together. But these tears were of hope. They told of new work, one as a seamstress, one as an inmaid, another running a stall. None belonged to Corrigan anymore. Rose clasped each hand listening. Elias watched from a distance, eyes soft. He knew the cabin had become shelter, not just for them, but for many souls, once crushed. One spring night, the wind rattled the panes. Only the lamp burned inside. Rose wrote at her desk. Elias mended a chair. She looked up suddenly. "Elias, do you think we deserve this?" He frowned. "What do you mean, peace?" "A home. Love. I was soul-called by a false name. Will the past always cling?" Elias set down his hammer and faced her. His voice was low, firm as oak. "The past is shadow, but you lit the lamp. I thought my life ended when Meg died. You thought you were nothing but a thing. Yet here we sit under one flame. If that isn't worthiness, I don't know what is." Tears welled in Rose's eyes, reflecting the lamp until they shone. Then, "We'll keep it burning all night." Seasons turned. Summer spread green over the fields. Rose sowed seeds, Elias cut hay, their laughter rising, where once only wind spoke. Each night while the town below slept, people could look up and see the cabin's light. Small, steady like a promise that somewhere freedom was no longer a dream, that love could grow out of ashes. Children began calling it the House of Light. To them, it was hope. To the women, once enslaved, proof that dignity never dies. To Elias and Rose, it was simply home and the beginning of a new world. One night, as the spring wind softened, Rose sat on the porch, her hand resting on her belly, where new life stirred. Elias sat beside her, saying nothing, only laying his hand over hers. Inside, the lamp glowed, throwing gold through the window. And they knew, no matter what storms came, the light would endure. Spring swept into Redstone like the earth's quiet whisper after long winter. Fields burst with wildflowers, purple-yellow, white woven in the breeze like a living quilt. Bees hummed, butterflies floated. Children laughed by the creek. In the cabin, the windows stood open. On the writing desk by the sill, Rose bent over paper hair, loose morning light spilling across the page. The lamp beside her was out giving way today, but its smoky glass bore witness to nights it had burned, keeping the house warm. She dipped her pen hand, trembling, but sure, Rose was born again in a small house on the hill. Ruby is gone. The false name is gone. Only Rose remains the name my mother gave me and the one I now claim as my own. A tear smudged the ink. She laughed softly, a wet smile, not bitter, but glad for life, for the right to err, to begin again. Outside, Elias hammered a fence post, the rhythm joining birdsong into a hymn of ordinary holiness. Rose looked up through the window, saw his frame solid steady her pillar. She wrote on planting words like seeds. Dignity is not for sale. It is not written in contracts nor traded in dollars. Dignity lives when we dare to say, I am no longer a slave. I am myself. And it is proven by the life I choose, even if small, even if simple, but mine. Wind rustled the page tender as a hand. Rose closed the journal. On the leather cover, she etched one line, Rose's life. She rose, stepped to the porch. The spring fields spread wide the sky, clear as glass. A swallow dipped low across the flowers and soared upward, higher still. Rose smiled, her eyes alight, and in that smile lay past, present, and future. The smile of one who had walked the darkest road and found light that would never fade. Dignity is not for sale, it is proven by the life we choose. Leave a comment and rate it from 0 to 10. Subscribe so you won't miss the next Wild West story.